It's a story that doesn't seem to make a lot of sense. A young man is driving his car down a country road several miles away from his house. He runs out of gas, and with his cell phone in his pocket, he begins to walk home instead of calling for a ride or calling for help. He leaves his wallet in his abandoned car. Then, as he's walking down the middle of a lightly traveled country road, he does not hear or see an approaching vehicle which strikes him and leaves the scene.
Hello and welcome to True Crime Rocket Science, the most authentic voice in true crime. Do you agree with the narrative that Court TV presents of what happened to Stephen Smith? I think there's a reason this case has gone unsolved for 8 years, and it is because the thinking around this case has remained in ruts, stuck in certain sort of tracks and lines, and it refuses to deviate from them. I think it's because the narrative we have is somehow off track. And so how do we get it back on track? And you might say, yes, the narrative has been off track because Stephen was murdered, but that's actually how the narrative started, that they thought he had a projectile injury, that he had been shot, right? And it's possible that he may have been, but I would caution to say,
when one note is off, it eventually destroys the whole symphony, David.
And so what note in the narrative you've just seen is off? Well, there are several notes that are off, but which is the first? Which is the most important? Well, how about this? A young man is driving his car very late at night down a country road several miles from his house. You might say Stephen driving his car at night or late at night hardly changes anything and is hardly relevant, whereas I would say it may change everything, actually, because what the very late at night does is it means human perception is suddenly taken down a few notches. Not only for the young man, potentially for a driver, if there is a driver as well. Do you have a strong opinion on this case? Do you have strong feelings about what actually happened? Now, if you've got strong feelings, strong opinions, that tends to suggest that maybe you know something about this case. Maybe you even know quite a lot. Well, let's challenge that. Do you know who the person was who called 911, what his name was? Do you know what time he called 911? And do you know who he was and sort of what he was driving? Yes or no? Do you know the answer to that question? Because it's important to have a thorough knowledge of this case if you're going to decide, you know what, I think I know what happened here. And so the answer is the guy who called, his name was Ronnie Capers. And he called 911 at 4:40 in the morning. Right? That's quite late. That's quite late in the morning to call, and it suggests that he called about 40 minutes after whatever happened to Stephen. It could have even been longer. And then in terms of the other question, what job did he do? Well, Ronnie drove a wrecker. And so if you say it's a quiet country road and no one drives on that road, well, at 4:40 someone was driving on the road and they eventually called 911 because someone was driving on the road at that time. And if he was on the road, weren't there other wreckers on the road as well? Now, we'll address the very late at night aspect in terms of ground level, walking on a road in a moment, but I want to fix other aspects from just the opening from Court TV. I want to deal with the introductory sentences right here to begin with. So first of all, it's not a young man that's driving, it's a teenager that's driving. In fact, I think he got his license the same year that this happened, right? Does the age of the victim matter? You might say, does the darkness matter? Does the age of the victim matter? Would it matter if it was a 16-year-old driving compared to, say, a 26-year-old or a 36-year-old? And I would say it does matter. It does matter that a kid driving has only recently graduated from school. In other words, is not a very experienced driver. Is not experienced with mechanics. Is not experienced with breakdowns. The other thing mentioned is this idea of he was several miles from home. Well, in fact, he was about 5 miles. And that is for a very young man, arguably a fit young man, who's dressed in sporty clothing, And you might say, was he dressed in sporty clothing? Well, he was wearing a Nike short sleeve shirt. His cargo shorts were certainly not necessarily sporty, but they were khaki Union Bay cargo shorts, and you could run in those if you wanted to. They were shorts. They weren't long. They weren't jeans. They weren't long trousers. And then on his feet, he was wearing blue Airspeed footwear, right? So he could have been jogging, for all we know, in order to get from the vehicle home. And we know Stephen was sporty. We know that he played baseball. He played baseball with Buster. And so that's also important to note. The final thing I would change in that introductory narrative is the reference to his car. He's not just driving his car. He's driven over 80 miles earlier that day, and if you add it up, actually 160 miles. That night he'd driven for almost 2 hours late at night, and one assumes he drove to school every day based on his schedule, which is every single day of the week he had classes. And so every single day of the week, 80 miles to class, every single day of the week, 80 miles back, every single day of the week, 160 miles. What does that do to a vehicle? And so it's important to know what kind of vehicle are we dealing with. And do we know that it's a 2013 yellow Chevrolet Aveo? So it was 2 years old at the time that he was driving it. In what sort of shape was it? What was the odometer reading? What was the behavior of that vehicle? Was it inclined to break down? But the bottom line is, a student driving a vehicle like this, 160 miles a day, 5 days a week, 4 hours a day, and coming home late at night, that can put some wear and tear on a vehicle. The vehicle needs to be qualified in this description as old or new, and also reliable or unreliable. We know that on the morning prior to the incident, that is July the 7th, prior to his leaving for nursing college, and he left that morning at 6 o'clock in the morning, his sister had to come out and fix his vehicle. Incidentally, the Exxon where he went to buy cigarettes is where his mother Sandy works as a manager. So the very late at night also addresses two other potential issues, but we'll address those in a second. Another question is, why doesn't he call anyone at 2, but one must say at 2 a.m.? Why doesn't he get gas? One must also say at 2 a.m. And so this is how I would amend Court TV's opening narrative. A secretive gay teenager is driving an unreliable car, long distance, very late at night. After midnight, just 5 miles from home, he appears to have some sort of engine trouble again. And now let's deal with the incident scene. Before we get to that, if you haven't subscribed to the channel, please do. By the way, I'm going to be continuing the analysis that I sort of aborted on the Murdoch case. I was dealing with the finances. I was dealing with certain other skeletons in the closet in terms of Alex Murdoch. We're going to continue with that since this is the last episode dealing with the analysis of the Stephen Smith case. There are a couple of additional things I might want to touch on, but we're going to return to Murdoch after this. Something else to note is I've left a link to my blog, Crime Rocket 2, in the description, and I placed some images from the incident scene that are too sensitive to appear in this video. And it's very important that you go and look at those images, because at a glance you kind of get a sense of just how serious this incident was, and you get a sense of what was going on the scene. So go and have a look at that link. It's also important to look at the road rash scarring, and I put those images on Patreon. If you're enjoying this episode, please like, share, leave a comment. You can also hit the thanks button, and let's get started. So obviously I'm not going to show any of those images in this video. Please, as I say, head to the link. You can do that right now, and then continue watching this video. But what is clear to me from the images is that poor Stephen must have died where he was found. You can see in the first image the fluid that is left is about a foot wide and appears to be about the width of the road. Also notice in the bottom left corner of that image a white line. And people have been very dismissive of that. Like, you know what, in America, there's a white line and it's for this and that. Well, for a pedestrian walking in the dark in the country where there are no sidewalks or street lighting, this was a little bit of space that he may have felt was allocated to him. And that would in a way have drawn him closer to the area where vehicles should be passing. And although in normal circumstances not a big deal, well, at night wearing a black shirt may be very unsafe. And so you can imagine how impractical it would be if he didn't walk completely on the road, if he walked off the road in the dark. The grass, especially in summer in South Carolina, is long, and often early in the morning in summer it's wet and dewy. And this was midsummer, and we also know it was overcast at the time of this incident. What we also know from the incident images is that in some of these images, Stephen's knees face away from the line, while in others, they face towards the line. And that is really just testing your observation skills, because you take that observation into other areas. And so one of the things you might want to look at is there's scoring on the top side of his arms, but they're not on the underside. Now, you would imagine if he'd been struck and he was still alive, that there would be some attempt to try and grip the road surface. As a cyclist, I can tell you, even with gloves on, you often injure your hands trying to brake as you go over a road, and that causes injuries to the underside of your hands. And there are no such injuries in this case. There are no injuries to his fingernails or fingertips either. In other words, we're seeing no defensive wounds. And now, in a scenario where there's a bludgeoning with a baseball bat, you would expect bruises as the arms and hands are raised in a defensive posture, but you don't see that. And so that brings us to the number 6 clue we all missed, and it's to do with Stephen's T-shirt. The one thing that's very curious about Stephen's position on the road is his T-shirt. Why is it riding high on his waist? Why is it exposing his midriff? Why is it up on his waist the way that it is? And also, why is the shirt intact? No holes, no fraying of the fabric. His arms have been scored by the tar, but his shirt seems to be undamaged. But it's hard to know for sure because we can't see the back or the underside of the shirt. And now we deal with another aspect from the court TV narrative.
Then, as he's walking down the middle of a lightly traveled country road, he does not hear or see an approaching vehicle, which strikes him and leaves the scene.
We don't know that he was walking down the middle of the road, and he very likely wasn't walking down the middle. He likely did see and likely did hear an approaching vehicle, but perhaps he felt he was right to walk, that he had right of way, in a sense, to walk in an allocated space off the main road beside the white line. And so if there was a driver who suddenly saw Stephen, he may have swerved violently to avoid him and then corrected, perhaps causing something like a trailer to whiplash or any long object being hauled, such as timber, to swing back. We also know that the incident occurred where there is a kink in the road and the surface of the road is irregular in places across the center line. If an approaching vehicle was traveling at high speed, it may have drifted to the right as it turned along this corner, or to Stephen's left on an already narrow road. The other thing to deal with is this narrative that he was walking down the middle of a lightly traveled country road. It's not a country road, it's a farm road. But the second part is right. It is lightly traveled, and it would have been even more lightly traveled at night. All the more reason to feel safe walking on the road, or to be walking at all, just around the corner from home. And he actually died about 2.3 miles from home. And so why is that so hard to believe or understand? Is that he was trying to get home on foot. And that brings us to the TCRS assessment. It's my assessment of what could have happened here. One scenario, it's possible that there are other scenarios, but this is one scenario, and one that I don't think has been considered by anyone up until this point. So we might imagine that if Stephen was struck by a vehicle, that he would fly backwards if hit from the front, or forwards if hit from the back. And both those assumptions make sense if he was walking in the middle of the road. However, if he was on the side of the road and perhaps running, then a nasty hit to the head from the front to Stephen's right side, above the right eye, but the impact coming from the left, from a vehicle veering to the right, and also him possibly running. In this scenario, it would possibly sweep his legs upward. And from a position from being struck very close to the verge, he might likely be spun around, and that momentum might cause his arms to start splaying out, and then his knees to rise up as his upper body comes to rest. And so his shirt would sort of curl up under him. So in this scenario, he may have spun around once or even twice, with his upper body spinning faster and his feet, legs, and knees rotating more slowly. That's my assessment, but I've got to concede some aspects do not make sense. I've polled my community following this case, and I see a huge majority want to believe that Stephen was murdered, and also want to believe he was murdered by a murder, or that a murder was involved in some sort of cover-up. I can see that. And so if I wanted to pander to you guys, then I would push that narrative. It's the narrative that many of you seem to want to hear. But that's not my job. My job is to investigate these cases and deal with an authentic narrative. What really happened? What's the truth here? Not what do you want to hear and what does my audience, what's going to be popular, but what is the truth here? And so goodness knows there is plenty of precedent for all of those suspicions in that particular area, that Stephen could have been murdered, that there could have been a murder involved, that there could have been a cover-up involved. All of those suspicions have merit based on what we've just learned. But then what would be the motive here? What would be the incentive? Who would make money? There's no insurance situation in this story as far as I can see. The other thing that is strange is the wallet that is in the vehicle. It is strange. But if Stephen was attacked, one would imagine they would steal something of value as well, unless the perpetrator was very rich. What I think this suggests is that he wasn't trying to get gas, he was trying to get home. Then why doesn't he call? Well, here are a couple of possibilities. Probably because he thinks it's very late and not worth the drama. Besides, he can hike it in 45 minutes, half an hour if he jogs home, and he is wearing athletic gear for that. If he was running along the side of the road, it's all the more reason this may have caught a driver by surprise, who may have swerved suddenly on instinct. And in fact, when the original person saw Stephen, he actually thought that he was seeing an animal. He thought he was seeing an animal lying in the middle of the road. That was his first impression. That's what Ronnie Capers first thought, the wrecker driver. So if he was running, all the more reason it may have caught the driver by surprise, who may have swerved suddenly on instinct, but kind of also too late. It could be that there are no skid marks because the road is already turning. And also there wasn't time for the driver to brake. It's also possible, and I've said this before, that the driver was using a kind of large-scale industrial-type vehicle where even if there was some sort of impact, he wouldn't actually even know it. He may have been totally unaware of it. And then finally, another question. Why doesn't he call? Well, his parents are split up. He may realize if he has difficulty commuting and they realize he's having difficulty commuting and it's not safe, he may be expected to live at the college or have to give up his car altogether or pay out of his own pocket to have his car repaired. And perhaps he doesn't want his parents dictating what he needs to do. The other thing is that not only his mother but his sister, both mother and sister, say that he became a bit more secretive in the last 2 weeks of his life. And so possibly what's going on with the vehicle and where he's been driving with the vehicle is part of needing to be secretive. Where were you that you were out so late at night? The other aspect could be that his mother might have been quite overprotective and he wanted to protect his mother from worry. That then brings us to staging. Why put him in the middle of the road if it's staged? If you want to stage a scene like this to say someone had been run over, why put someone in the middle of the road? And also, why would you stage it to begin with? Why not hide the body? Finally, if the Murdochs were involved and they wanted to deliberately murder Stephen Smith, well, how would they do it? They had a malicious supply of arms. We know what happened to Maggie and Paul. So why wouldn't they use a gun? And one thing an independent review may find, I doubt it, but what they may find is whether the hole in Stephen's skull, which has been reported several times and was the original assessment, maybe that was caused by a bullet after all. I want to conclude by leaving a cryptic message that was recovered from Stephen's iPad. I want to leave that on screen and see if you can make sense of what he's trying to say there. So I'm not going to take it further than that. I hope you've found the analysis in terms of these 6 clues that has improved your knowledge base and sort of opened your mind to other possibilities. And then time will tell where this investigation goes and what will ultimately come from it. Also, bear in mind, I'm going to be doing another video dealing with the Murdoch finances and how how he managed to squirrel away money that is now out of reach from investigators. Quite interesting financial gymnastics. So look out for that. Thank you for listening, and I'll see you guys next time.